Hello everyone and welcome to Meanwhile in the West, my weekly series where I read through the letters to the editor in my local paper, the West Australian, and I criticise the stupid people who write in stupid things. First up, is this a joke? 30th of July 2014. I found great humour that illegal boat people, asylum seekers, are suing our country for illegal actions, detaining them on a customs ship. I'm sure they would have had shelter, meals, and access to bathrooms and medical care on board. It brings to mind the episode when a burglar, injured on the job, sued for damages. E. Blake Ashfield. Okay, so here's the backstory. There's 157 Tamil people from India set sail in a boat to Australia in order to try and seek asylum. They were intercepted by an Australian customs vessel, whereby they were held on board that boat for about a month, and they were taken back, and the plan apparently was to return them to India. That fell through, and they were then taken to a variety of detention centres throughout the Australian detention network. I think Cocos Islands, Curtin Detention on the mainland, where they were still trying to convince them to return to India, at which point they refused, and they were then shipped off to Nauru for processing, as it were. So, part of the reason that they weren't able to return them to India was because lawyers acting on behalf of these asylum seekers, because of the way it happens here, that these asylum seekers were held were held incommunicado within this boat. They had no contact with the outside world. And this is what typically happens with asylum seekers in the Australian asylum seeker sort of detention network. And so lawyers for the last couple of decades now pretty much have been petitioning the courts on their behalf without actually having any contact with these people. Because these people don't have any access to legal representation. They are arbitrarily detained without legal representation, despite not actually having committed any crimes. This is the appalling state of justice within this country. So, in this case, it was argued that picking them up at sea, they weren't actually in Australia. I don't think they were in Australian waters, which is why they weren't. So picking them up at sea and detaining them on board the ship and possibly sending them back to India against their wishes, sort of amounted to piracy, actually. Especially since they had no intent to commit any crime in Australia. Coming to Australia is not a crime. Arriving here as an asylum seeker is not a crime, and it's not a crime under international law. It's not even a crime under Australian law. Everybody has the right to come here and seek asylum, no matter what the government says. So, the lawyers had argued that essentially that amounts to piracy to pick up a group of people simply because the government didn't want them to come here and claim asylum. Now, it's subsequently emerged that their treatment, that essentially the customs vessel they were held on was not set up to have 157 people on it for a month. Well, at least not 157 asylum seekers on board for a month. So that the conditions on board were pretty terrible. Now, not the worst thing in the world, and some might argue better than being on a leaky boat in the middle of the sea. But whenever you take somebody into detention, you take responsibility for their well-being. And the Australian government, by putting these people in detention on this boat, were responsible for their conditions. And the reports were that it was pretty bad. Now, you might say, well, these are reports and this is what we say. And that's part of the problem with this whole thing, is that ideally, I would like to see these claims tested in court, and if they stand up to scrutiny, that the Australian government be held to account, and if they are shown to be nothing but lies by people who are not genuine refugees, then fine. But the government and subsequent governments, and for the last sort of 20 years almost, have been unwilling to allow these claims to be tested in court. They simply don't want it to get that far. They don't want to have an independent evaluation of it. And so the idea they want to do is keep asylum seekers locked up outside of the sight of the Australian media and the Australian judiciary, which is why we ship them off to small, tiny Pacific nations like Nauru for processing. The other thing is that it seems to me to be blatantly unfair to have mandatory detention for asylum seekers for any other purpose other than security and health checks. So the official policy of the government, and has been for the last 20 years for various governments, is essentially that the only reason that we lock up people who come here seeking asylum is because we need to be sure who they are and that they don't pose some kind of threat, they're not terrorists in disguise. And we also need to make sure that they're not carrying any kind of diseases with them. That is, we need to do health and security checks. And the idea being that once they've passed those health and security checks, there's no real justification for detaining them after that. And so to hold them on a boat for a month against their will, without doing any kind of security or health checks, because they weren't doing any processing at the time, seems to me to be completely in breach of that argument. And the last bit of this letter, this idea of there's sort of an apocryphal tale, and there's probably real-life examples of it, of where a burglar has broken into somebody's house, has injured themselves in the commission of the burglary, and then sues the homeowner for not, for having a house in an unfit state. And this is usually passed around as, this is the absurdity of the legal system that they would... and all of these make a fundamentally wrong assumption. And the idea is this. If I, as a burglar, break into your house, then I deserve to be punished for my burglary. That's fair enough. I break the law, I deserve to be punished. And a certain amount of injury sustained during the breaking into your house, most people would accept is, my own stupidity for doing it. But if you have a large pit dug in your house with spikes at the bottom of it, and I slip into it and die, most people would say that that is not a fit punishment for burglary. Most reasonable people. And so whenever these cases come up, what they really are is that the person's house was so unsafe that anybody may have injured themselves, and that regardless of the fact that somebody broke in, it was simply an unsafe house, and that the kinds of injuries that the burglar has sustained is way disproportionate to the crime that they committed. I mean, in those cases, it's perfectly reasonable to say that actually the homeowner has a duty of care to keep their house in some kind of reasonable and, not particularly dangerous state. And in our country here, in particular, there are laws against you having man traps in your house. You are not allowed to have deadly traps in your house. And the defence that, if they didn't break in, they wouldn't get killed, is simply not a legal defence here. You have no right to put those there because it's accepted that somebody breaking into your house doesn't deserve to be killed for that. And also, it's generally considered a hazard because other people may have a lawful right to enter your house. For example, police or firefighters or ambulance officers may need to enter your house in an emergency. And so as a general result, across the board as a society, we've decided that we are not going to tolerate the idea of people having intentionally dangerous or negligently dangerous houses. And the same goes for this customs ship. So these people who they picked up, the argument is, and this was yet to be tested in court, and I'd happily concede if it's found to be bogus, that's fine. But the argument is simply that their detention on the ship amounted to a cruelty that is not commensurate with their crime. One, because they didn't commit a crime, and also wasn't something that the government, was forced to do. They could easily have taken them off that ship at any time they wanted, but they decided to keep them on there because they were hoping to get rid of them, and that's not a particularly reasonable justification. Anyway, next letter. Turning the air balloon, 30th July 2014. It used to be that if you stubbed your toe, or worse, you got a certain satisfaction of saying, "Oh damn," or something less mild. But those among us who use the strongest profanities as part of normal discourse can find themselves with nothing to turn to should more harrowing circumstances arise. This has to be frustrating. So-called colourful speech shows a lack of understanding and appreciation of the English language. D. Hicks Beckenham. So the interesting thing about this, of course, is if you look back historically, the same claims have been made every generation for the last at least 100 years, and I suspect a lot longer than that. I suspect you could probably look back to Roman times and find people saying exactly the same thing. Language evolves, and generally what happens is that the language that is particularly crude for one generation becomes more commonly accepted for the next, and eventually passes into being almost common usage and having no weight at all. Time was, it still is actually, that words like bloody and damn were considered very strong language. Now in Australian culture, they have no weight whatsoever. And always there is this argument, there's this claim that people who use the worst of swear words in everyday conversation are left with nothing that they can do to express when they are in, extreme pain or when they are, extremely upset. And I don't think this holds weight. My experience working with people who swear almost constantly, like the proverbial sailor, is that they are quite able to make it known when they are genuinely upset. And this is because actually word use, our selection of words, is only a small part of our communication. A lot of the emotional content of our communication doesn't necessarily come from the words that we actually use. And so one can use the same swear words and convey a completely different emotional tone. And so I don't think that really is necessarily all that frustrating, that you just don't have words for the most extreme sort of feelings. I think you just use maybe the same words, maybe not, and you can express yourself just as well. The other thing is, there's always this argument that it shows a lack of understanding of proper English, and really that just misses that language evolves. Australian English in particular has always been fairly well laced with profanity, and that's not been because we have a lack of appreciation. That's because that is the language that we are wanting to use. We deliberately choose to speak like that as a way of distinguishing ourselves from other cultures, particularly English culture. And so I don't know, it just sounds to me like old people saying, well, back in my day, which I think is just rubbish. So D. Hicks from Beckenham, fuck yeah. Choice and effort. 31st of July, 2014. Tony Abbott's work for the Dole is how it should be. One's own survival is key to independence, which leads to confidence. Choice of work is not an option. Margaret Blowfield, Bunbury. I'm not quite sure how one's own survival is key to independence. I would have thought one's own survival is key to pretty much everything, because without it, one doesn't really have much left. And the thing that is often missed in this idea of work for the Dole, so for those of you who are unfamiliar, for the last 20 years or so here in Australia, there has been there's been a program called that's colloquially known as Work for the Dole. The idea is, if you are a job seeker, if you're on an unemployment benefit, then the government will get you to do work. Unfortunately, the work that they get you to do is not actually real work, because if it were real work, then that would just be a job and you wouldn't need to be on unemployment benefits. So this is akin to what you get prisoners to do, which is breaking rocks and digging holes, and those kind of things that have no actual purpose they're not actually productive work. So the whole point of this is, well, there's 2 points. Firstly, it's the legitimate idea is that to prevent particularly long-term unemployed people from getting out of the habit of actually, say, attending work, getting up in the morning, going to a job, that kind of thing, is a bit of work for the Dole. It just gives them a routine and something to do, so they can at least be in the habit of doing work-like activity, even if the work that they're actually doing is not particularly productive. But on the other hand, what most people like about it is it seems like punishment. If you dare to be unemployed for any significant period of time, then the government will make you, essentially crack rocks on a chain gang, is the way that people like to think of it. But the point that most people miss is, that it is not particularly used for work. It is not adding to the economy. It is not actually helping people gain job skills, because these kind of things, like if you were actually studying and gaining job skills, you wouldn't be on the unemployment benefit. You might be on some kind of student payment. And if it was productive work, you would simply have a job. We wouldn't be getting unemployed people to do it. We would be employing people to do it. And also, there's a lot more of the people who need to do their work for the Dole than there are actually positions for them. And so inevitably it ends up being these stupid make-work things. You can't even get people going and pick up rubbish, because we get the prisoners to do that. So they end up doing these stupid things where they kind of have to rock up, stand around, be useless. The people who are actually doing work on these kind of, on the building site or whatever, don't want them there because these are useless, kind of unskilled, unemployed people. And then they get sent away with a tick in the box for having done their work for the Dole. So overwhelmingly, it just makes people feel good about punishing unemployed people for being unemployed. Anyway, a prayer before carving, 4th of August 2014. A year ago, my wife noticed that at her butcher, 25% of the meat was halal. Now it's 100% halal. You cannot buy non-halal meat there. I heard that Coles and Woolworth are heading in the same direction. This may mean nothing to the average atheist, but there are many faiths in this country, the main being Christian, who do not want their meat prayed over by a Muslim cleric. Please allow us to retain choice when buying our meat in Australia. M. Muns Cardinia. Okay, so yes, this is, and I've actually commented this on other videos before, a common thing here. So it's not actually the butchers, it's the abattoirs. And the majority of abattoirs in Australia, well, I think all abattoirs in Australia do halal meat, and there's something like 70% of them do only halal meat now. So that means that for a large proportion of people, and a large chunk of the meat that gets sold in Australia is by default halal. Obviously pork is an exception. Why is this? Well, actually, it's got nothing to do with Australian Muslims. It's got everything to do with our export industry. So a big part of the meat industry in Australia is meat for export. This brings in a lot of money, and one of our main export markets is the Middle East. Middle East countries like our quality of meat, lamb and I think in particular, but also beef. And so a large amount of the meat that gets processed here in our abattoirs goes to the Middle East. So because the Middle East is almost entirely Muslim, this means that the demand is for halal meat in particular. Which means that, so what's happened is steadily, so originally you would have a production line within the slaughterhouse which would be halal, and you would have other production lines that weren't. And it was found that simply the halal processing didn't add much to the process, and it was easier to simply be entirely halal. Then you wouldn't have to worry about quality control or concerns by Muslims that they might not be getting completely halal meat. And so most of them are not just halal, they're certified. So there are halal certification schemes whereby Muslim organizations will certify that you are doing things correctly. And they hire, a Muslim imam or whatever to say the magic words, and they slaughter the animal in the halal way. Now there is a bit of outrage, particularly amongst Christians, about this. On a number of fronts. So one, it's seen as being as an Islamification of our country. This misses the point that me eating halal meat that is not labelled as halal, I don't choose it as halal, but simply as a byproduct of the export industry, is not Islamifying my diet. I don't believe in a God, therefore whatever they happen to say, their sprinkly little prayers over that piece of meat, makes absolutely no difference to me. It doesn't change the meat in any way. And so they haven't Islamified my diet at all. Secondly, as I said, it's for the export market. This isn't Australian Muslims forcing their way of life on us. The Australian Muslims have always been able to get their halal meat from their specialist butchers. Now they don't have to worry so much. That's all there is to it. The other thing is, I'm not quite sure why the Christians... So then, as it says in this letter, the Christians often argue they don't want to eat halal meat. I don't quite understand what the argument there is. If I was a Christian, I wouldn't believe that Allah, the Muslim God, was real. I wouldn't believe that they knew what they were talking about, and I wouldn't believe in the efficacy of Islamic prayer. And therefore, I wouldn't see halal meat as being anything blasphemous. It would just be like somebody saying a prayer to the Easter Bunny while slaughtering your meat. It's still just meat, and if their God doesn't exist, then, I don't see what the argument is. Now, some people have argued against halal meat on the basis of animal cruelty, because apparently it involves a certain kind of, where they cut the throat and they drain the fluids. Now, I would point out that nobody seems to be successfully challenging these practices on the basis of existing animal cruelty laws, which means that, as far as I can tell, what they're doing in the abattoirs can't be that cruel. We have some fairly strong animal cruelty laws here, and whatever they're doing doesn't seem to be breaching any of that. I suspect, although I'd be willing to be shown wrong, that it's no more cruel than a lot of other non-religious animal slaughtering practices that are being done, which is the reason why I suspect nobody wants to actually change the laws to outlaw that kind of treatment on the basis of animal cruelty. I suspect that if they did, that would also outlaw a whole pile of things that are ordinarily being done for non-Muslim reasons, just simply for the efficiency of the abattoir. And the other thing that gets brought up occasionally in this is the idea that we're paying an Islamic tax, that because the abattoirs are certified as halal, they're paying money to a certification body, and that money makes our meat cost more. Which misses the point that actually, if they didn't pay that money, then they would lose the overseas markets, and it's the overseas markets that actually subsidise our meat, and that therefore the meat would be a bit more expensive. And I would argue simply that there would be abattoirs out there that would quite happily not be certified if they could produce meat cheaper as a result. And so there you go. I would be willing to accept an argument based on animal cruelty, but I really can't see any other complaints holding any water, to be honest. Lastly for this week, no school, no dole, 5th of August 2014. It is self-evident that undereducated people are more likely to become unemployed, and unemployed people are more likely to come into contact with the justice system. Ensuring kids go to school is a logical way of breaking this cycle, so linking welfare payments to school attendance seems like a no-brainer. Your move, Mr. Abbott. C. Morgan, Leaderville. Okay, so number one, things that seem self-evident often are not true, or at least seeming self-evidence is not a reliable indicator of truth, so I would like to see that. But I think that, yes, there is a correlation that overwhelmingly those people, well, actually we know, overwhelmingly those people who come in contact with the criminal justice system are unemployed and undereducated, and that, yes, the more educated you are, the better chance you have of finding work. The problem is that it's not necessarily a straightforward causation, that simply educating people doesn't necessarily improve their chances of employment or avoiding the criminal justice system. That's because there's probably a third factor, or in fact, actually, there's probably a whole bunch of factors that all interrelate. It is probably more the case that whatever your family of origin happens to be, who your parents are, the situation you're brought up in, the sort of your immediate cultural context, probably influences whether or not you stick with your schooling, and whether or not you get a job, and whether or not you end up in contact with the criminal justice system. The fact that most career criminals come into contact with the criminal justice system before their schooling would have finished, and that actually committing crime can interfere with their ability to finish school, would suggest that simply pushing people to stay in school is not a way to stop them from ending up, doing crime. The other thing is that, the majority, for many people, the kids who drop out of school don't never find work and end up committing crime, their parents are likely to be in a similar situation. And so saying to them that they'll lose their welfare payments if they don't send their kids to school is unlikely to, for at least a chunk of them, have much of a big effect on them. Simply because the reason that they, their kids are committing crime is because possibly they're committing crime, or their lives are so chaotic that they're in no position to stop their kids from committing crime, let alone force them to go to school. Now, that's not to say this won't work for some people, but it is, like many of these policy areas, it is a seemingly simple solution to a complex problem, and so therefore is almost certainly not going to be particularly effective for a lot of people. I suspect that most of there will be some kids, there will be some parents, where if you tell them that you're going to withhold their welfare payment if they don't send their kids to school, that would motivate them to keep their kids in school. But I suspect that this is a small amount on the fringe of the problems, not the people who have the worst problems in that area. And the other thing being that these welfare payments to parents are supposed to be for the child's benefit. And so to withhold that because the parent is not insisting the child goes to school, because the parent is unable or unwilling, or lives in such chaotic conditions that they're unable to, or whatever, seems to me to be punishing the child for the failing of the parent. So I would like to see, before a widespread sort of rolling out of such policy, I would like to see some evidence that it is actually effective in raising attendance rates, at the same time that it's not causing more deprivation for those children who are most in need. Anyway, that's it for this week. I hope you're all doing well, and I'll see you next week when we find out what's happening in the West. See you later.